we have the pleasure of introducing Alison. Alison is an expert scientist in dietary intake and nutrition science at the Nestle Research Centre in Lausanne. And she leads a project on portion size and balanced nutrition. And that's what she's going to talk really a little bit about today. Prior to that, she was a PI on a large study looking at dietary intakes across 9 countries, examining diet intakes, lifestyle, eating behaviours of infants, toddlers and children. So anyone who's done that work knows what a challenge that is. Since 2019, Alison has been an adjunct professor here at University College Dublin, and she actually co-supervised a PhD student looking at portion sizes with myself. So we're doing some collaborative work on that. So I'll hand over to Alison in 2 seconds, who's going to talk. So just to remind everybody to mute and turn your cameras off. We will be taking questions at the end. So if you want to type your questions in during the talk, do so, and we'll come back to those at the end. But also we'll encourage everybody to turn on the microphone and cameras and to chat a little bit at the end as well also. So I'll hand over to Alison, and thank you very much for joining us today, Alison, and giving us a talk on portions and responsible consumption.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I'm really happy to be with all of you today. So we're going to start out with a look at some recent findings about the impact of portion communications on consumer behavior. And then I'm going to switch to look at different elements that could be used to help derive a credible portion recommendation. So let's dive into some of that research. If I can get my slides to move. Of course, they moved when we were, there we go. When we were doing the practice, they moved. Okay, the first study I wanted to share with you is this one, which was a meta-analysis of food labeling, but they used a very broad definition of food labeling that included package labels, menu labeling, and also point of purchase labeling, so grocery store or checkout area labeling. And they were interested in consumer behaviors, sales and purchase data, industry responses like changing the types of foods that are offered near the checkout in the checkout area, and health measures. And this meta-analysis included 60 different studies, including randomized control trials, interventions with controls, and pre and post tests. And what they did was they tried to estimate the impact or change related to different components in the diet. So, and the number of subjects that were included depended on the type of food, because not every study included all these different elements. But there were at minimum 760 consumers who were evaluated for whole grain interventions and more than 43,000 for energy. So if we go from the top, this study showed that labeling interventions could reduce consumption of unhealthier foods by reducing energy by 6.6%, by reducing fat by 10.6%, saturated fat, sodium, and other unhealthy food components like sugar or sugar-sweetened beverages by 13%. The interventions didn't have very much impact on overall carbohydrates, protein, or other healthier foods, but the interventions did result in increasing consumption of healthier fruits and vegetables and also whole grains. So this study is useful because it provides a really broad overview that food labeling in a quite a large context can have an impact on consumer behaviors in terms of food intakes. The next study I wanted to highlight is also a recent meta-analysis, and this one looked at healthy, what they called nudges to reduce unhealthy eating. And again, multivariate analysis, there were 90 articles included in this. And what they did is they divided the types of communications into 3 different domains. One was cognitively oriented nudges, so descriptive labeling, what they called evaluative labeling. So that would be either smiley faces, green check marks, or some other kind of way to indicate a healthier food option. and visibility enhancement. So where are the healthier products placed on the shelf? They also had affectively oriented nudges, which they called either healthy eating calls. So comments or either written or oral instructions to choose healthier options like make a fresh choice or have a salad with lunch, as well as communications that focused on hedonic enhancements with attractive naming. And they use the example on this slide of dynamite beets. So just calling out odd vegetables maybe in a way that would make them seem more positive. And then finally, they had behaviorally oriented nudges, and these included convenience enhancements like making healthier foods either pre-packaged or sliced and ready to eat, grab and go. Also positioning foods in the cafeteria line so that the healthier choices were first and the more indulgent products at the end. And also using size enhancements. And so in this case, they used larger plates for healthier options and smaller plates for less healthy options. And what we see overall with this meta-analysis is that the cognitively oriented nudges, so descriptive labeling and visibility enhancements, tended to reduce consumption by an estimated 64 calories to reduce the unhealthier choices. The affectively oriented nudges were a little bit more effective than that, about 129 calories less, whereas the behavioral nudges really had the most impact. Overall, the interventions were more effective at reducing unhealthy than increasing healthier eating. And finally, they made a point to comment on the similarities between children. The effect sizes were similar between children and adults, which is also very interesting. They suspected that children would not respond the same way as adults, and that was not shown. So I think this study is useful. We can see that descriptive labeling is perhaps one of the smaller nudges that we can use, but it could be very important in the context of a daily diet if people are eating more than one packaged food during a day. And so in our own research that we've done, literature research focusing on labeling elements that can change consumer behavior, we have found that information cues, as was mentioned in the previous slide, like energy amounts, fat, and sodium content, can reduce consumption. Visual cues, this graphic looks at hand sizes to help guide consumers to responsible portions, but other types of visual cues like graphical icons on a package can help guide a consumer to a responsible portion. Food companies also have impact on the size and the package innovations to promote responsible consumption. And there was some interesting work that was done looking at mayonnaise, and that they found that if people scoop mayonnaise out of a jar, they tend to use more than if they squeeze it out of a tube. So the way that we interact with our food packages can also change consumption. And finally, they found that clear and simple labeling communications are the most effective. And if anybody's looked at a complicated food package recently, you can see many, many competing icons, and this tends to dilute the message. So I would say that the results from the meta-analyses I showed you and other research that we've evaluated, labeling elements can influence consumption, but the effects are modest. But they're still there. So that's encouraging for us. And that informational and visual cues should be simple and easy to understand. And one other thing I didn't show results about, but some of the studies address this. Promoting healthfulness may provide consumers with this notion of the license to eat more. So if you go overboard with the healthfulness communications on some products that really should be eaten less frequently or in smaller amounts, we have to be aware that that kind of a communication might actually give people the idea that I'll have 3 cookies instead of 2, for example. So let's switch gears now and talk about how we can define a credible portion. Sorry, we're stuck again. Okay, well, I don't know why this screen is not going. I'll try it this way. Okay, so there could be several different possible inputs into defining a credible portion. One possibility is to look at government regulated serving sizes. And these would be either based on typical consumption patterns in a country or scientific consensus. And I've given the illustration here as the reference amounts customarily consumed, or RACs as they're called in the United States, which lists a serving size for every product category, in addition to a lot of additional guidance to the industry for implementation. Another possible input would be dietary guidelines. And I've included here the Irish food pyramid, just as a representation that national food-based dietary recommendations apply both to food groups and specific categories, and do include some recommendations about servings to consume. National survey data looks at typical consumption patterns across all food categories, and that could also be a source of defining a credible portion. And finally, we can look at the role of a diet in the diet. So core foods versus discretionary foods, or foods that are nutrient dense versus foods that would be eaten a little bit more infrequently. So let's take a look at each of these different sources in a little bit more detail. The first one is that I wanted to point out was evaluating regulated serving sizes from around the world. The map on this page shows where serving sizes are regulated. And this may be a big surprise, but there's a lot of gray there, which means they're not regulated. And what's communicated on nutrition facts panels in these other countries is per 100 grams or per 100 milliliters, typically. In the countries that are highlighted in blue, they have assigned a serving size, as I said, based on either a scientific consensus or information about consumption in that country. And I've given a little snapshot of what this might look like for chocolate, cookies, milk-based beverages, milk or milk-based beverages, major entree sauces like spaghetti sauce, soups, and noodles. And there are several things to notice here. First of all, as you go across the columns and look, or sorry, across the rows and look at the values in each of the columns, you can see that while there's some similarity, there are also some differences and inconsistencies across the countries. So even for chocolate, we can see a low of 25 in several countries and a high of 40 in Canada and Indonesia. We also see that some countries like Indonesia provide a range, whereas other countries provide a value. And if they provide just a single value, then they may provide implementation guidelines that would allow the food manufacturers to make single serve packages that were smaller or larger than the recommended value within some tolerance level. And then the other thing to notice is that there are some blanks. And so there are some countries that don't actually have a regulated serving in every one of the categories. So we have missing values, for example, for soups in Colombia and Thailand and Mexico. And either it's because they don't consume a lot of soup, or they just prefer to defer to the 100 milliliter value that would be kind of a standard without additional detail. So another source of information we could use for assigning a credible portion is comparing dietary guidelines. And I showed you a picture of the Irish food pyramid in the other slide, but here are some pictures of the food-based dietary guidelines that are coming from 5 African countries. I'm showing these because these are, this is the first step in Fanny Salez's PhD, where she's evaluating dietary guidelines and comparing them across countries. And she started her research in this comparison project with African countries. But I think it's really important to note that the visual representation of these different food-based dietary guidelines can vary quite a lot. They're not all a plate or a food pyramid. They're really quite different country to country. But there are similarities in terms of which food groups or types of foods they include, and they all generally recommend some kind of a healthy dietary pattern for the people in that country. The goal would be to consume a varied diet with these different types of foods so that you could achieve, for the most part, all of your nutrient needs from the foods and beverages you consume without having to take supplements. And the figure that I have on the right-hand side is a recent paper that was done on the mean portion sizes from dietary guidelines across Europe. And this study was done by Italian researchers, so that they've included the Italian recommendations, which are in orange. And then they have Southern European countries in gray, Central European countries in yellow, and Northern European countries in the lighter blue on the right-hand side. And we can see that for many, many food types, the recommended amounts from the dietary guidelines are pretty consistent. But for a couple of things, the folks in Italy recommend higher values, like higher values for potatoes, higher values for fresh vegetables, and for fish and legumes. Another way to approach this question about what is a credible portion is to say, what does typical consumption look like? And I'm very happy, and we use this data quite a lot. EFSA came out with this food consumption data. I've given you the URL at the bottom of the page, where they've harmonized dietary intake data across EU countries in a 7-level hierarchical food group classification. And they include charts on total population and consumers only, giving information about mean, standard deviation, and distribution of intakes across 8 population groups, either all across Europe together or in individual countries. And I've plotted here chocolate consumption, for example, on the top in blue, and mean milk consumption in yellow on the bottom, in comparison with a median of regulated values like we saw in the previous slide. And you can see that there are some countries that are consuming chocolate above this median regulated value. But in terms of milk consumption, while there are a few countries that consume higher portions of milk, most countries are below the median of the regulated values. I'm also highlighting one other study that looked at median intakes. This one used the Irish National Adult Nutrition Survey, the NANS, and the 7-country Food for Me study, and compared the values with US RACs. And we can thank our Professor Skibney and company for this lovely paper in Nutrients in 2018. Median portions from NANS and Food for Me were highly correlated, which was very good news. And also, they were very highly correlated between the average values from Europe and for the US. And what this study does is really support the notion of a standardized approach for portion size quantification. And I don't want to talk too much longer, so I've got one more slide and then time for questions. The last thing I want to mention was assessing the role in the diet. And I'm going to use dietary guidelines for Americans as an example here, where they provide charts in the dietary guidelines for every age and sex category. This one is showing the healthy dietary pattern for adults. And they show you the number of servings or portions that you could be eating for all the different types of food groups, and that would provide a certain amount of energy, but not all the energy that you would need for a day. And so, based on the total calorie level, they've also indicated the limit on calories for other uses or discretionary calories, which I've plotted in the graph on the right-hand side. And so you can see that the more calories that you have available in your day that you could eat, the higher the number of discretionary calories. But from a labeling perspective, we're looking at a 2,000 calorie diet as kind of a standard. And so if you were going to be designing foods to limit discretionary calories, you wouldn't want to exceed about 240 calories per product if that might be the only source of discretionary calories in your day. So I'm going to quickly summarize and say on-pack portion guidance has the potential to impact consumer behavior and reduce intake of unhealthier ingredients and foods. Portion guidance is very complicated with many potential inputs like regulated serving sizes, food-based dietary guidelines, and national survey data on intakes. And research is ongoing at UCD and elsewhere to explore different analytical approaches to determine credible portion sizes. And we'll look forward to a future presentation from Fanny to talk about this when she's had a chance to do a little bit more of her research. So thank you very much, and I'm super happy to answer any questions.